Hey Optimancers, Tree and Monk here. So this is a viewer requested video, and a viewer requested to me that I tell the story about how I came up with the idea for the God Wizard. Now, for those who are not aware, the God Wizard is not a selection of spells or races or a specific build. It's a playstyle that I came up with as a way to help the other players through the use of battlefield control, buffing, and debuffing, rather than using the traditional wizard spells like Fireball and Magic Missile and so forth. So to tell the story of how I came up with that idea, we have to go back a few years. I'm talking about the early 2000s. Because back in the early 2000s, the game for Dungeons & Dragons was 3.5. So after 3rd edition, they came out with 3.5, which was just kind of a cleaned up version of 3rd edition. Took out some of the problems, but then some other problems came up later as more splat books came out. And late in the life of 3.5, it became a very complex system. And far more than in 5th edition, it became a system where the difference between an optimized character and an unoptimized character was vast. Now, at this time, I was playing in a group that was run by my friend Sean, and he was running the Shackled City campaign, which was a Paizo campaign. This was before Pathfinder. And we were playing this campaign, and he had invited a friend from another group that he played in. And I had never met this guy before, but we'll call him Bob just to protect his identity. So anyway, we played in the same group together, and Bob and I got along pretty good. And after a few months of playing together, then Bob approached me and mentioned that he had a group that he played out of his house on a different night of the week. And he asked if I would want to join that group. He mentioned that he had an existing campaign, but I'd be welcome to join that campaign. So I agreed, and then on the week that I was to start playing in that campaign, I emailed Bob and I asked him, what kind of character should I make? I don't know what the other players are, what characters they have. And he emailed me back and he said, you can make whatever you want, but I think something like a fighter would probably serve this group well. And then another thing he mentioned in the email is he said, this is a really difficult campaign and characters are dying. So when you make this character, I wouldn't hold back on optimizing it. So I took his advice and decided to make a fighter. And now, fighters are not my specialty, but I was active on the optimization boards at that time for Wizards of the Coast. And so I did a little bit of research and determined that one of the fighter builds that got the most praise was called the charge build. And this is where you took a Goliath fighter and you took a number of feats and you dipped into barbarian and so on and so forth. And what you could do is then you would charge, and when you charged, you multiplied your damage through different feats and abilities so that you could do just a massive amount of damage in a round. So I made my Goliath fighter and I showed up for his group for the first time. Now, the only people I knew there were Bob and Sean. So Bob's wife and a few other of his friends played in this group as well. And I had never met them before, but Bob asked what I had made. I told him I had made a Goliath fighter. And then one of the other players at the table, we'll call him Dean. So Dean said, oh, you made a Goliath fighter. Oh, we'll be like brothers. And I said, oh, you're a Goliath fighter too? And he said, yeah, my character's a Goliath fighter as well. And so Bob looked at my character sheet, said, everything looks good. He asked me a little bit about how it worked. I kind of mentioned that it was a charge build and it did lots of damage when it did charging. And then we started to play. So soon into my first session, we got into a big fight. It was a pretty tough fight. And when it came to my turn, I went and made my attack rolls. I did my charge. And I did about 60 points of damage. The enemy died and my turn was over. And some of the other players were shocked. They're like, you did 60 points of damage? And then I explained, well, yeah, because I have Lion Totem Barbarian, I can attack twice. And because I have this feat, I double that damage. And because I have this feat, I double that damage. And then I use power attack and so on and so forth. So then soon came Dean's turn. And so Dean took his fighter, walked up to an enemy, attacked it, and he did like 10 points of damage. And I could see by the look on his face, there was a look of resignation. And I don't know what the look on my face was, but I certainly felt just horror, because now I suddenly realized that I had completely overshadowed his character. We had the same race, we had the same class, except I had so much more damage than him, without giving up defense, without giving up mobility or anything like that, that in the end, his character was going to be essentially useless compared to mine. and it was embarrassing because I had never met Dean before. I had never met these other players before. And then suddenly, without ever intending to, I had stolen the limelight. So I continued playing through the night and I just felt terrible. And it hadn't even been an overly successful session. I mean, the party sorcerer had died in that session. So we were still having PCs dying, and I completely overshadowed another character, and I was kind of in a tough spot because I didn't know what to do. But I know that on the drive home, I really thought about whether I even wanted to be in the campaign anymore. I felt terrible. I thought, what must they think of me? Going in and just stealing the limelight like that, completely overshadowing Dean's character. I know he had a terrible time, and he felt bad about the whole situation as well. So when I got home, I emailed Bob, and I said, listen, Bob, I don't like the way that my character is overshadowing Dean's character. What would you think if I retired this character and made something else? And then he responded and said, I think that might be a good idea. And I'm sure it was a topic of conversation after I had left. So I had to think about, well, what do I make? Do I just make a terrible character? I could do that. I could just not optimize at all and make a character and then go in and we'll all continue dying all the time. And then I thought, what about doing something else? What if instead of trying to be really effective, I try to make a character that makes the other players really effective? Maybe I could take Dean's fighter or any of the other players that hadn't optimized their characters and make their characters more effective. So I started looking through spells because I figured that was the best way to do it. And at that time, spells were still my specialty. So I looked at the spells, and in 3.5, there were just a million different spells that did a million different things. And a lot of them were effective, and they weren't damage-dealing spells. I thought, what if I made a character that only did that? What if I make a character that doesn't kill the enemy at all? I mean, the kind of spells that were considered maybe the best at that time were what they call save or die spells. They were spells you cast on an enemy, they make a saving throw, and if they fail, they die. I thought, what if I don't take any of those spells? What if I don't take any of the damaging spells? I'm just going to concentrate. I'm just going to look at the spell list and see what kind of spells can I do that will help other players. And the main thing I decided was the best way to help the other players tactically was through battlefield control. If I raise a wall and it separates the enemy, then the party can take on that enemy one half at a time. And that party's going to take a lot less damage, and then PCs are less likely to die. And then I thought, and I can maybe buff players, right? If they're having a tough time hitting or they're not doing a lot of damage, I might be able to cast spells and improve them. Another thing I thought is there were a lot of teleportation spells in 3.5. What if I took spells where I could move players around? So if I saw somebody was getting in trouble, I could move them into a position where they are at less risk. And then the players who maybe have more hit points and more armor class are put on the front lines instead. And what if I took spells that just disabled enemies rather than killing them by slowing them down or maybe just taking some of them out of the action for a while and giving the party a chance to deal with the other enemies? And so then, after analyzing these spells, I determined that Wizard was my best choice. With 3.5, Conjurer was my best choice. And so I made a character. It was an Elven Conjurer. And then I went to the next session, and I introduced my character. And Bob asked to see my character sheet, and he looked at my character sheet, said, Wizard, great, we just lost our sorcerer. We could really use somebody to cast some offensive spells. And he looked at the character sheet, and then he looked at the spell list, and he got to the first level spells, and he said, you didn't take Magic Missile. And then he went down into the second level, and he's like, where's your Scorching Ray? And then he got to the third level, and he's like, you don't have Fireball? And the rest of the table was in shock. And they're like, what? You don't have Fireball? What does your wizard even do? And I said, well, I'm going to try to help out with battlefield controls and spells that help you tactically. And they're like, that sounds stupid. That's not going to work. Your character's going to end up being useless. And Bob agreed. This character looks like it's going to be useless. I said, well, do you mind if I play it anyway? And Bob said, yeah, I guess that's all right, but this is a tough campaign. We've already had a TPK a few sessions ago, and we're having party members die all the time. If you can't even help with stuff like Fireball, things are going to get really bad. And I said, listen, just let me try it. So we played our first session, and the first thing I did in the first combat is I raised a wall of stone. It separated the enemies. The party was able to take care of the first half, and then take care of the second half. And then we went to the next combat, and I did a similar thing, and the next combat, and I did a similar thing. And throughout the night, we went through and no party members died. But nevertheless, every time I cast a spell, Bob would always look at it and go, "Really? You're going to do that?" And I would do it, and then we would win the fight. And so, after that, session after session, I played this character, and no PC died for the remainder of the campaign. And I was really enjoying playing the character because it was completely tactical. I was rolling very few dice with this character. It was always about looking at the battlefield, figuring out what I could do to help my party members, and doing it. And it always seemed to work out in a way, never in a way that made the fight a cakewalk, but it always just gave that tactical edge to us, enough so that our side always won. And when I saw somebody was in trouble, I could always cast a spell that would get them out of trouble. And so we often ended up fights, and often the party took a lot of damage, but no one was ever dying, no one was ever going down. As for me, I always just stuck back, out of the action, just casting my spells, affecting the battlefield. Now, I made an assumption as we were playing, and as no party members were dying, that everyone had kind of gotten on board. They certainly stopped making comments when I cast spells in combat, so I assumed that they were starting to figure out that this was really helping them. So when the campaign ended, Bob made a mention that, "Boy, this campaign sure got easy about halfway through," and the rest of the group all agreed. And I said, "Well, I think I helped out." And Bob laughed, and he said, "But your character is useless." And everyone at the table agreed. And on the way home, I thought, that is so marvelous. I played a completely optimized character, and I overshadowed no one. I overshadowed no one to the point where they felt like I was being useless. None of them clued in the effect that these spells were having on the survivability of their own characters. And the fact that the moment that character was introduced was the moment they found that things got easier, for me, was incredibly powerful. So powerful that I was inspired, and the following weekend I sat down and I started to write my first Treant Monk's Guide to Wizards. And that tactic, throughout 3.5 and then Pathfinder and now in 5th edition, I still find effective for the exact same reasons. And of all the play styles for wizards, with wizard subclasses, we talked about 10 different wizard builds with 10 different styles. Some were going into melee, some were doing lots of damage, but still my favorite remains, to this day, playing the God Wizard. And I've heard from countless people over the last 10 to 15 years how they have used the same tactic and had similar results. So I don't have a lot more to say about that, but somebody asked me where it came from. I think it's an interesting story, and it is 100% true. And so that's it. That's where the God Wizard came from. And until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, have some fun. D&D's for everyone. Thanks, Optimancers. Talk to you next time.